The liminal is the space in which the transformation, it's the in-between. It's where the magic happens, right? It's the metamorphosis. It's where the caterpillar turns into goo.
Welcome. I'm Ben Boyce, and this is the Dr. Junkie Show. Did you know that Colorado currently has a prison operating under what's commonly called the Norwegian model? See, in Norway and in lots of other countries, prisons don't look like maximum security boxes glazed in razor wire. They usually look like a college campus or a small group of cabins. When people commit crimes, they sometimes have to serve time, but that time is devoted to giving them whatever they need to become productive members of their larger society. That's what prison should be. Whether you're a conservative who probably takes a fiscal stance where less money spent is better, or a liberal who simply believes humans should be treated with dignity and respect. Both sides agree, at least in theory, that we should use programs that have been shown to be fiscally responsible and effective at rehabilitation. That's what Norwegian model prisons are. Today I have a great conversation with Dr. Ashley Hamilton, who seems to be involved in nearly every cool program currently operating out of Colorado's Department of Corrections. She's involved in the prison newspaper, Inside Report, the prison radio station, Inside Wire, the prison podcast, Within, and the University of Denver's Prison Arts Initiative, who puts on plays with incarcerated people every few months. And of course, she's also been a big part of getting our Norwegian model prison off the ground, the Beacon, which you'll hear us talk about today. Now look, I'm a cynic. That's no surprise to anyone who's been listening to this podcast for a while. It takes a lot of evidence to make me believe things are changing, because most of the systems in our culture are so deeply ingrained and interconnected to so many other systems that we usually see more lip service and window dressing than actual change. But this is an incredibly powerful pilot program, and our sincere hope is that it picks up steam and takes off across the country. It's long overdue. You can find tons of links in the episode description to all the projects Dr. Hamilton is currently involved in. This is actually a conversation I've wanted to have for a long time. So I hope you enjoy Dr. Ashley Hamilton. I dove into your dissertation. That's only been a couple of years, right?
7. 6, 7.
Doesn't time fly? I thought it was the same year as mine, 2018 or 17, I thought.
17, yeah. That was 6 years ago, 7 years ago.
Wow. So I guess I'm official now, yeah. Well, do you want to just start with a basic introduction, who you are, where you teach, and where'd that come from?
Yeah. My name is Dr. Ashley Hamilton, and I'm the executive director of the DU Prison Arts Initiative. And I'm also on faculty at the University of Denver in the Department of Theater in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Yeah, and in terms of my education and my background, I have an undergrad BFA in performance from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and then a master's and a PhD from NYU in theater and communities, with the specific emphasis on prison theater and devising theater, interview-based theater as transformer, as rehabilitator.
Lesson number one for the people that have ever studied under us is if you're going to write a dissertation, you don't have to write it on something stuffy and silly. As I started to read yours, I was like, yes, this is that sort of outside the box stuff that most of the people that were alongside me, they didn't know what to do. I wrote mine about the war on drugs, but it was nowhere near as creative as yours.
Oh, no, I love that. Thank you for saying that. And, it's fun. Sometimes I'll pull my dissertation back up and just thumb through it. And I'm really proud of it. I mean, it's wild that already in just 6 or 7 years, how much I've learned and how much I've grown and how I'd already write it different, when asked different questions. And
it takes 5 minutes, I feel like, after you write something and you're like, it's perfect. And then you come back and read it the next day and you're like, who the hell wrote this?
Yeah, but I sent my dissertation to my grandma. My grandma read it. So I feel like a lot of times when you meet academics, they have a very specific expertise in a niche area, which is very true of me as well. And I think that there's an amazing opportunity for us as academics to work to be as accessible to the general public as possible. I don't know, it's funny though. One time I was at a bar, or I was at dinner and I was sitting at the bar and there's some guy next to me and we started chatting and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Oh, I replace house, like windows on houses for when, there's like hailstorms." I was like, "Well, that's really unique. Like, that's interesting." He's like, "What do you do?" And I just said, "I make theater in prison." And he was like, "Wait, you just said I was unique. Hold on." And I think sometimes I like forget that I'm kind of this very niche role because it's just my life.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel the same way. I look back 10 years ago. I never would have dreamed that I'd be doing what I'm doing. And in the day to day, you just always feel like it's kind of, you check your calendar, you got stuff to do, you're running around. You always feel like you're not doing enough. I don't know how you could possibly feel that way, considering what we're going to talk about today, because I keep finding more stuff that you're involved with. Why don't we just start with the dissertation since we already mentioned it? Was it at NYU?
Yeah, so it's at NYU. I was in Steinhardt. And yeah, it's called Toward Rehabilitation, Devised Theater as Liminal Transformer in a Women's Maximum Security Prison. And basically, it's a case study of looking at a workshop I taught in a women's max prison in New York, where I worked with 13 women on devising a piece of theater based on their own personal narrative, and specifically with an interest in narrative around the liminality of life.
Should we define that term probably?
The liminal?
Yeah,
yes.
What is liminal? I love that word, by the way.
I love it too. So liminal, how I sort of maybe in layman's terms and how I describe it is this idea of the in-between, right? It's the space, if we think about a transformation or a moment of change or a journey with a beginning, middle, and an end, which is also an interesting way to think, because as if we have beginning, middles, and ends, right? I'm not sure that's so true, but the liminal is the space in which the transformation, it's the in-between. It's where the magic happens, right? It's the metamorphosis. It's where the caterpillar turns into goo.
Whatever this is. Yeah.
yeah, right.
It's not a butterfly, but yeah, it's something.
And it's funny because at the time, I think I was really just becoming familiar with the concept of liminality. And I feel like I actually now just have a practice of like naming that I live in the liminal. We live in many ways in the liminal, but also that the liminal is where the good work happens, right? It's where where the healing happens. It's where the awe, the possibility, the realization. It's like the liminal is the moment where you're beginning to realize. It's like the moment, I think it's where the magic happens. And especially as an artist, I think it's really where the magic happens. Whether we're talking about rehearsal room being a liminal space for a play, or we're talking about a ritual in a church being a liminal space for healing and connection, or we're talking about the moment in class where a thought connects for a student as the liminal. Yeah. So I don't know.
Like those moments. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually to get back to my dissertation, I created this curriculum, which you can see in my dissertation, where I asked my students in that class to explore a liminal moment in their life. So we looked at sort of the before, the quote middle, the quote end, right? And what was the liminal. And it was fascinating, right? Because I gave them a lot of leeway in terms of choosing their liminal moment. And they, it was this kind of maybe what we'd call shallow, as, some folks wanted to explore the first time they had a cheeseburger.
Nice. Yeah.
All the way to like coming to prison, right? Or losing a child, or the first time they went swimming, or the moment where they fell in love, or, so it's just interesting where people go. And a lot of my work is about, and especially how it's continued to evolve since writing my dissertation, is that a lot of my work is about creating a space that allows people to step in to decide and reflect on who they are and where they want to go. I really work to try to create autonomy in the choosing of the exploration.
I want to flag and make sure we come back to the question I just should have started with, which is, what got you into this, but we're working through it, and I wonder if we'll hit it along the way. It was 10 women, if I remember right? Was the dissertation project?
I started with 13, and then I think I write about 11. One of them went home in the middle, and then one left the project. Gosh, it's so funny. It's like fuzzy now, and I can't believe that it's fuzzy.
7 years.
How could that be? Yeah, and also just like how much has happened since then. And
yeah. But they more than wrote them down. The liminal space, it's funny we pronounce it wrong because I've read it 3,000 times in my life, but I've never had a conversation about it. You actually attached performances to this. So it was more than just writing it. You actually then took these narratives that people wrote, and they were meant to be performative moments. When somebody here I'll put it in my own body, us outlaws who go to prison and we realize this is what I am, and now you better perform in this space and follow the rules of the penitentiary. There's very few opportunities in that space to toy with new identities, to put on whatever the performance is, happy, sad, I'm doing something, I'm reforming, I'm crying, I'm going to church. And the second you start toying with those things, that's the liminal space where sometimes you trip on something and you realize, I never would have thought behaving this way would feel right. And now that I've done it, when else would you have done it? It gives people a way in. And in the meantime, they're writing their own stories. So there's this dual process going on where they're telling their own story.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just talking about this in my meeting earlier about how so much of my work is about inviting folks to reimagine the possibilities of themselves.
Yeah.
I think I do this with myself. We all do this. We get so stuck in our identities and our ways of like how we're, quote, supposed to or should show up, or who we are, or I don't do that, I do this, and all of that. What the beautiful thing about then bringing an arts practice or opportunities for arts practice into a prison is, I often have folks who are drawn to our programming who are lifelong artists, right? They started drawing when they were young, or they were in theater in high school, or they play their own music, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's like, this is radical. The guy joining the musical who like, that's an insane thought.
Yeah, tats top to bottom. Right. Yeah. Presents himself with his chest out, big old muscles.
Yeah. Super alpha, super whatever, all of that, all that. And then suddenly I'm like, all right, you're going to dance across the yard, basically. And what's amazing is watching people rediscover themselves in that process. It's so beautiful and it's so brave, especially in that space, depending on the facility you're in, depending on the culture, what state you're in, depending on all those things. It's so brave. I mean, it's brave to make art anywhere in the world. It's such a vulnerable act, actually, right? It's such a vulnerable act to be an artist. But then to do that in a, maximum or medium or whatever facility, prison facility, where there is very specific expectations and rules about how we act and what's appropriate and what's safe. And we're talking like literally physically safe, right? Yeah. But what's been so beautiful to watch evolve in our work is watching like that dial shift of like, suddenly it's cool to write poetry. It's like cool to whatever, be in the dance class. And I love that. So going back to the dissertation, the curriculum began with them writing, and then it evolved into they performed their own stories. So another big part of my work is I'm very interested in what happens to us as humans when A, we perform our own stories, but B, when our stories are reflected back to us. I'm very curious about the power of performance when either we get to live out our story in front of others and be witnessed in that way, or when someone performs our story and we get to witness our story in front of us. That's continued in the last 7 years in a lot of ways in my work.
I talked to Andrew Draper. We'll get to the podcast briefly, but I spent some time with him a couple of weeks ago walking around Beacon, which we'll also get to in just a minute. And I'd asked him, how do you feel about hearing your own voice on audio? And he had the same reaction. I remember that it's sort of the same phenomena that when you hear yourself perform, you think, that's what I sound like. And you catch phrases that play totally different than you realized in saying them. You give yourself this cool reflection it forces you to either get better or to stop recording it because you don't want to hear it anymore. And that is largely the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a mirror, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's so human, right? Like whenever anyone hears their own voice, I feel like people are always like, oh my God, what? Like I sound like
Yeah.
that?
Yep. And then those of us that get used to it, it's kind of scary because you're like, yeah, I guess that's what I just sound like. So
Yeah,
now
yeah. I think
it's
at first when I
meditation and
found my voice,
mindfulness. Right. You're
yeah,
just this thing
right.
out in the world. Just let your consciousness be what it is. At least you'll leave something behind, make it worthwhile. Go ahead.
Yeah, just realizing that like everyone feels that way, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, okay, I guess.
Yeah, teacher privilege, right? I have students that I was giving a chance to not write the final project paper and instead presented as a quick speech. And 90% of them were like, they've got the COVID. I've been inside forever. I can't imagine. And I'm like, yeah, but trust me, I used to feel the same way. And then when you do it, you just are like, oh, it's so fake. It's just your body, your flesh turning on you and being like, warning, warning.
Oh yeah, I taught public speaking for years. Like that got me through graduate school, and I taught public speaking a lot inside. And I don't know if a lot of people know this. Public speaking is the number one fear before death.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
people would rather die.
And I've been there. It's so weird. This is
That's
one of those
crazy.
identities I can pop right. It was not
Oh,
that
me
long
too.
ago. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's
Well,
weird
and
once you move on to be like, well, that's weird that people feel that way.
like, why are you so terrified? No, I mean, it's interesting because I think because I'm a performer and I've been a performer my whole life, I'm super comfortable speaking in front of people. That's never been my fear. Trust me, I have my own other fears like that I battle. So
Yeah.
I'm not like, exempt, but
Yeah.
that's just not the one that I have. When I see what it does to some people, it's like an interesting psychological study about fear of being seen, I think.
Yeah. I want to also acknowledge, like you've said this thing that I've said on the podcast repeatedly. As an educator, you walk into these spaces not sure what to expect, and with you as a dissertation and reading your descriptions of surprise, even though you were expecting exactly what happened to happen, to watch people embrace these things and actually grow and put on identities that they not only had never tried to put on, but they hadn't even dreamed were a possibility for them. And I'm over on the education, the egghead side that's in the same facilities as you're in. And I'm watching some of the guys that are also in both programs go through these same awakenings where they're like, I never would have thought. And
Right.
it's a weird feeling to be like, I mean, I'll take a little credit, but I just stumbled into this the same way as y'all did. And I feel day to day like I'm still finding those same things. Like I never would have thought this was an identity for me, but it's a
Mm.
cool experience because in prison, as weird as it seems, even as an incarcerated person, I don't think I saw that as possible as it is. And it seems to me to be the rule, not the exception. Once you expose people to these programs, the majority of them actually have some
Flourish.
sort of massive identity shift.
Oh yeah, it's so beautiful. I love it.
So what
I
the heck
love
got you
watching.
into it?
Oh, that's such a complicated question. And it's a question I get all the time, and it's
Yeah.
so funny because I wish I had like a clean answer, but I have like this epic story, really. So I'm a performer. I was originally just a traditional theater performer.
Mhm.
And as I said, I got my BFA at CU, and then I moved to New York City to be an actress, to be on Broadway. And I started pursuing that. I had a day job. I was a nanny. I had all these odds and ends jobs. I got a manager. I was like hustling
Yeah.
and doing the thing. And I was working a bit, but I was miserable. I was really talk about identity, right? I had checked the boxes, like I was doing the thing that I had set off to do, and I had this story about what I was going to do, and I was doing it, and it wasn't aligning
Hmm.
in my soul. Suffering is such an interesting thing, whether it's mental suffering or whatever, emotional, physical, because suffering is actually can be such an incredible portal for transformation back to the liminal. And I'm really proud of myself because somehow at 22 years old, I stepped into, I don't know how I was conscious enough to do this, but an invitation to sort of just reimagine my identity. And I had a friend at the time who was teaching a theater class with folks experiencing homelessness in the projects on the Lower East Side. And here I am, like, white girl from the suburbs. And I said, can I come? Can I just watch? I was just curious, And I took like 3 subways and walked through the Lower East Side. And I had just an incredibly transformative experience that evening, watching what I now know is the applied arts, theater for social change, community engaged theater, all these different names, educational theater, even we could argue in some ways a bit of drama therapy. I didn't know it was called any of that. I didn't even know those terms existed, but I knew that I loved what I was seeing, and I was drawn to it. And there was a man facilitating, he wasn't facilitating the class that I witnessed, but because my friend was facilitating it, but he was part of the program. And he and I started just chatting at the end of the evening. And I was kind of like, what do you do? Who are you? And he told me that he taught music making and creative writing and hip hop in the prison and jail system in New York. And something in me, before I could even think, said, I want to do that. And I just said to him, can I learn more about that? Like, I'm super curious. And, it's so interesting because looking back now, this was 13 years ago. He was so gracious with me. He was so patient with me. And he let me kind of become like his shadow. And we started hanging out, and I started following him around to various events and things, and soon became introduced to, he's a community organizer and activist, and he just let me kind of follow him around and learn. He hooked me up with some folks who were doing, prison art, prison ed work. And I walked into a jail for the first time when I was 23 in New York. And I taught a creative writing class with very little idea of what I was doing. But man, was I hungry I was so happy to be there.
You were in the right spot.
And I knew two things immediately. One was that I had found what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, A, and then B, that I had no idea what I was doing, so I needed to go back to school. So I'm really grateful because I did. And then that led me to my master's and my doctorate. And by the time I left New York in 2017, I had taught for 4 prison education programs. I was going inside 4 or 5 days a week. I was making theater, teaching associate and bachelor's classes. I was doing all kinds of different stuff and was deeply, deeply in love with the work and knew I had kind of found my jam. And it's interesting because that feels like phase 1, right? Like leading up to then I moved back to Colorado. I'm from here. I was born in Colorado. And I moved back and started DU Pi. And it's been a whole journey since then. So
I guess we don't need to belabor the point, but I always have this sticking question on that very first opportunity to go to prison. Have you tried to trace back why your stereotypes weren't as sticky as strong? Then most people in that moment would say, thanks for the invitation, but I'm not trying to go in that place. I've met quite a few people lately because of where I work. For me, it's obvious why I have different beliefs. I lived there for a while. You learn some stuff, but most people on the outside that don't have to go in there. Have you tried to figure out, did you have a friend as a kid that went to prison, or why were your thoughts different than most people's?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's a couple things. I didn't have direct connection to anyone who was in prison. I did have actually my first boyfriend went to prison, but I didn't learn that until years after. I didn't have like a family member who was in prison or something. I think it's my personality. I don't remember having a lot of judgments and stereotypes about people in prison. I don't remember being like
Shawshank Redemption.
I don't remember being scared. I don't remember being scared at all. Isn't that weird?
It is, given that, we were the Oz generation.
I don't know why. But to be fair, I'm an interesting personality in that way. Like I am not fearless. I am absolutely someone, I am well acquainted with fear. But I think the things I'm afraid of, this is back to the public speaking thing, are unique. I graduated from college on a Friday and I moved to New York City on a Sunday. I've traveled a lot alone. I don't know. I think I'm a little bit unique in that way. But I also think I am a personality, and this has only gotten more true for me. I am deeply drawn to complexity. So
you found the right spot, because prison
I think that might be a lot of it. I think I was like, complex, let's go. I want to understand.
Those of us inside it. Wow. So,
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, and I also think one thing, I have a lot of my own insecurities and judgments of myself, but one thing I do pride myself on, and in my practice, I pride myself on my ability to hold people in their complexity. I can see someone's quote darkness or humanness, their light, their the dark, sticky corners of a person, and it doesn't
it doesn't
I
taint
can
the
hold
whole
it.
product.
I can
Yeah.
hold it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is funny because I left this out of the story, but originally when I moved to New York, I had made a deal with myself that if I hadn't, quote, made it in theater, which I'm not even sure what I thought that meant, but if I hadn't made it in theater by 28, I was going to become a therapist. And I think, and in a lot of ways, that is what happened anyway.
Hmm.
I think that's a lot of it, is that I really pride myself on holding folks in their complexity. And so I think that that's why I wasn't scared.
So as we move into what the heck is going on in Colorado Department of Corrections, is it worth maybe defining a few terms for folks like normalization?
Sure. So normalization is a concept that our former ED of the CDOC, Colorado Department of Corrections, Dean Williams, introduced to this Colorado DOC based on concepts of practice in Norway, Sweden. So this idea of normalizing a prison environment, making it more like a traditional lived experience on the outside of the walls, which I mean, I'm curious also what that means. I don't know what, but meaning
Yeah,
like
right. Yeah.
rather than the sort of the extreme abnormality of the prison space, particularly the physical space, the architecture, the aesthetic, which is so extreme. It was a very extreme and in a lot of ways, very practical and also safety based, right? Choices were made. How do
Population
we
based as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So normalization was a concept that Dean introduced about 5 years ago. And I think he planted the seeds for and is continuing to grow, even, past his time in the DOC. He left a couple months ago, and they just named Mr. Stansel as our new ED, who is someone I have deep respect for. And am really grateful to get to work with and have been working with for the last few years. So, yeah, I think that concept created the groundwork for a lot of what we've seen develop.
Yeah,
Um,
I think I heard Dean describe it as if the word normal being a part of normalization. If it's normal for somebody on the outside world to do it, unless it's a security threat or something we absolutely have to restrict, it should be normal for somebody in prison to have it. You're trying to normalize people to life on the outside, which sounds like this big term, right? But I came and visited. I didn't know you were there the first day, but I teach some students now at this new facility called the Beacon, which is
mm.
sort of our beacon of normalization in a way. You want to tell us a little bit about it? And it sounds like you were in a lot of ways involved with getting this place put together and opened.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the Beacon at Skyline is, we call it the Beacon at Skyline, a correctional community. So we actually don't even use the word facility or prison.
Nice.
But the Beacon is basically was and is an opportunity for us to reimagine a lot of how prison works and really take a moment to pause and ask ourselves, with residents and with staff in collaboration, CDOC staff in collaboration, what does it mean to truly rehabilitate? What does it really mean to prepare people to return home or return to the streets and be productive members of society? What does it mean to use your time inside to better yourself and heal? What does it mean to create working environments for staff that are safer and less traumatizing and keep them around and keep them excited to come to work? What a concept, right? So I was on the founding creation team of the concept and worked with a group of incarcerated residents and CDOC staff to imagine the pedagogy and philosophy of the facility and also a lot of its systems. So we we started dreaming it up in April of this past year. So almost a year now, 10 months ago. And I was working on it pretty quietly all summer and fall. And then we opened our doors in January. So as of today, have something like 90 residents there, getting more residents every day. And we have 16 community development managers and community development coordinators who are residents who work in mentorship roles and work very closely with staff on different areas of within the facility, from aesthetics, talking about normalization, aesthetics and operations, to reentry, to education and programming, community engagement, culinary, wellness, nutrition, all of those things. So we have residents working with staff to design and build up those areas. And then I help support the overall philosophy and pedagogy. And then also I'm actually the director of community development for the Beacon. So have a heavy hand in just supporting the community developing and working with staff and residents on that. And it's been just, the opportunity of a lifetime.
Tell me about it. I think my boss said, color me impressed. I was like, that's about as radical as he gets in a response. But he went out and visited a couple of weeks ago, and we were, looking for some movement, but I don't know if it, so as humans, when you sit in the hot tub or the pool too long, you never feel the hot or cold anymore. You just get used to it. And I wonder if it still strikes you, because you go to so many other prisons, as radical as it is. Because I walk in, and I'm like, the first day I was there, I pull up and my students are waiting outside, and I'm like, this is kind of weird. I go in and there's pets at the door. There's turtles that live there. This really normal thing. It smells like potpourri. Other incarcerated people come up and meet me, and they're like, hey, how you doing? We all walk around together. My students actually showed me around the facility. Every office is painted a different color. The COs that actually worked there were
smiling.
Well, and there's this thing that if we don't have a ton of time today, so we can like flag it for future conversation, but we've both encountered it, that in every prison, there's us and there's them. I'm saying us because I was incarcerated for a while.
Right.
When we talk to each other in prison, we use last names if we don't know you well. If we know you well, we use your nickname or your first name. If you're staff, we use ma'am or sir. We're just trying to self-preserve. And if you are a CO, we're actually supposed to be clever enough to know your rank by reading the stripes on you and call you captain or lieutenant. I never figured that stuff out. That seems to be something that to some degree is being deliberately, it's surprising to me, because from a perspective of the people that work there, they're trained to really struggle. The way they're trained lets them struggle with how would you ever erase those barriers? But from being there for hours now, it feels like they've done a really good job. We sit down and eat together. I sat down and ate with my students. COs were in the same chow hall. They walk in and out without...
The dining room, Ben.
Dining room. I'm trying, right? This is so weird. Well, and it's weird. I get into that space. I bet your new arrivals do the same thing. My brain goes to institution. I lived in prison for a while, so I find myself shortcut heuristically labeling stuff.
No, and I did. I said it on purpose, right? Because I have to do it all the time too. I've been there for months, and I still am like the dining room.
Cafe, the cafe or the dining room.
The cafe.
Yeah, it's going to be a cafe at one point. Is that right?
Yeah. So we call it the Lighthouse Cafe, and it's in the Beacon. And it's really interesting. It is just one big opportunities for us to understand and explore this concept of institutionalization, and not just for residents, but for staff too. And we had a lot of conversations about, what do you want to be called? We talked about that for hours.
What's the answer?
Well, it depends on the person, right? And so that's the other thing, is normalizing, allowing people to also, we don't have everyone does this, everyone does that.
I like that.
At DU, I know people who go by their first name. I know as professors, I know people who go by doctor. I know people who go by professor, whatever.
Those doctors, I know.
Yeah, no. It's so funny, because when my students, I teach in a theater department, so we all go by our first names. And so sometimes I'll have a non-theater student, they'll be like, Dr. Hamilton. And I'm like, whoa.
Who? Oh, me. Don't do that. You just made power show up.
Ashley's
right. I don't like it when it hits me.
Yeah. It's one big opportunity for us to ask ourselves, what's really serving us? Oof. And that's the question on the table. And that's what we've been sitting in. And it's complicated. It's not clean. It's not,
I feel like
It's funny.
it's
I
so
remember,
simple.
yeah, I mean, I remember like months ago, I said something to the warden, like, so this is what it's like to open a prison. And he said, oh no, this is not, he goes, we know how to open a prison.
Yeah.
This is not opening a prison.
Yeah. Huh.
Right. This is stopping to look at every question, every thought.
I can pitch a lot of your stuff. I want to make sure we at least dive through Inside Wire, Inside Report within
Yeah.
DU Pies play stuff. So do you want to just pick a few of those or all of them if you're really good and dive
I can
through
give
them?
you like the overview, the menu.
Yeah, for anybody that wants to listen, these podcasts and productions are way better than mine, and all of them, if you can visit, the plays are a little difficult to get into, but they're worth your time.
Oh, thank you. And your work is great, Ben. No
Yeah, it's all right.
self-deprecating
It's all right.
necessary.
I don't have the
Um,
staff you have.
I have an amazing team.
Yeah.
So yeah, so DU Pi, I guess maybe I'll just give the overview of that. DU Pi is a program, the DU Prison Arts Initiative. We're contracted with the CDOC, and we bring arts-based programming into every prison in the state. But we robustly work in 12 facilities in the state, and we cover all of the artistic modalities. So we have, as you mentioned, a podcast called Within. This is within.com. You can find us on Apple and Spotify, SoundCloud. And we're a podcast that's created across 3 prisons, and all of our work content is recorded, designed, interviewed, audio engineered inside. We currently have about 20, I think we're at 24 episodes. We've existed for about 4 years. That's our podcast. And then we have the only statewide public-facing prison radio station in the world, Inside Wire, Colorado Prison Radio. And you can, right now on your phone, download the Inside Wire app or check out coloradoprisonradio.com, and 24/7 content coming to you from inside the walls of the CDOC, music shows, features, interviews, so much good work. We've got 4 studios across the state in 4 different prisons where the content is being crafted and created and designed and recorded and edited, and then streamed to your ears. Very proud of Inside Wire. We have the only statewide prison newspaper in the country, which is created in Fremont Correctional Facility, but includes content from every prison in the state. It's called Inside Report, and you can find it at insidereportnews.com. And we also have a creative literary arts magazine that accompanies it called Reverberations. Poetry, art, really amazing stuff. You have a lot of students who are published in both Inside Report and in Reverberations.
Yeah, I've seen some of it, yeah.
And then we do large theater productions, as you mentioned, and we do those 1 to 2 times a year. They're huge pushes. They're productions behind the walls, and we do full light set costumes, the whole 9. And we just did a production of Godspell at Territorial and Fremont Correctional Facilities, and we are super amped. We're about to start our next production. We're going to be doing The Wiz, the musical. We just got the rights, so I can say it now publicly.
Nice.
Yes, we do theater productions. And then we also have ongoing arts-based courses that are similar to the work you do, 15-week arts-based courses that we supply CEUs through our university, our UCall program at DU. So they're not college accredited right now, although I hope for that one day, but they are CEU bearing. And those cover all of the artistic modalities too. So we're busy. We've got a lot going on.
Yeah. I don't know how you had time to even do this, so I really do appreciate you sitting down. I'll link all this stuff, and I'll give you some great intros and outros. I'll share your definition of rehabilitation after we're done here, because I forgot to mention how you define it in your dissertation. But
yeah, and Ben, if you ever want to talk more, I'd love it. And I know we're recording your podcast today, but I would really love to get to know more about your story and your journey.
Yeah, anytime you want to talk, let's go grab a beer in Canyon City or grab some coffee in Canyon City, or we can eat at the cafe at the Beacon.
Yes, there we go. Look at you.
Said it right. Yeah, double win.
It's funny how we all those norms, and especially like you said, you're previously incarcerated, so
weird. Yeah. And how
years
just life is all the stuff we even talked about today. I would not have expected. I was actually getting my PhD at DU, and this is how I guess walled off they were. I didn't know you guys were there. Kind of sucks because I definitely would have been over there poking around. And
yeah. What year were you there?
I graduated in 2000, I think it was 18 is when my dissertation went up. So between 2015 and
Okay,
18.
yeah. We had just started, so we were probably, yeah. But I'd love to hear more about your story, and thank you for the work you're doing, Ben. I hope you know you're really beloved inside, and folks are super inspired by you. And so just know I'm cheering you on.
I really appreciate it. I am cheering you on even more. So you can be my hero, but I appreciate the kind words. I'll
All
talk
right,
to you
more
soon.
soon.
Yep, later.
Okay, bye.
That was Dr. Ashley Hamilton, and you can find all sorts of additional information, along with links to her projects, in the episode description. Thanks to her for taking the time to stop by and chat, and for her consistent work across the state of Colorado aimed at rethinking incarceration and rehabilitation. I mentioned I'd share Dr. Hamilton's definition of rehabilitation because it's such a radical take on the term. In her dissertation, she defines rehabilitation as, quote, a process of compensation for undoing any harmful effects of punishment. As a previously incarcerated person, that really resonated. See, when we go to jail or prison, most of us clearly need to rethink some things and change our perspective on life. But what we usually get in prison is all the stuff you heard us talk about in this interview: reinforced toxic masculine identities, lack of options for new growth, incentives to get involved in penitentiary games that can get us in a lot of trouble, and the prolonged trauma of being locked in a cage with no way of escape. Of course, most of us need to work on ourselves when we arrive, but by the time we get out, that work is usually buried beneath a mountain of new trauma, new thinking errors, new pain and confusion. Traditional prisons don't heal people. They lock them in cages that tend to make their problems worse. The Beacon is radical, but it's just the first step in undoing our current crisis of mass incarceration in the United States. As many a social justice advocate is prone to point out, the U.S. is home to just 5% of Earth's population, but 25% of Earth's incarcerated bodies, along with 25% of Earth's overdose deaths. Those are shameful statistics, but many of us don't even know about them. To undo that cultural norm, we have to give people tools for success when they're released, or even if they're never released. Being in prison shouldn't mean not existing in the free world. It should mean realigning our priorities and being exposed to new tools for success that will incentivize us to become stable, franchised members of society. I'm sure you'll hear lots more on this topic, especially since I'm currently teaching at the Beacon. Until then, love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce. Here's my issue with people that I know I have a lot in common with. I make these great summary notes that are like 3/4 of a page. We could knock it out in 30 minutes and then we cover like 2 of those things because in the process we go down some rabbit hole that's totally worth exploring. And I imagine that's probably what's going to happen here. The Dr. Junkie Show is a free podcast with no commercials. If you want to support the work we do here, consider buying one of my books. If you're into outlaw stories or prison cinema, my new book, The Spectacle of Punishment: Lessons from a Century of Prison Films, it might interest you. In it, I explain the consequences of our cultural obsession with prison films and television shows. We're literally scaring ourselves into needlessly locking up millions of our neighbors. If you want to learn more about drugs, addiction, and anti-drug laws, check out my other book, Dr. Junkie, one man's story of addiction and crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. And if you want to just keep listening and learn more for free, click the next episode.